Got to submit that picture to the Guinness Book of World Records as most SDG placards. So I think we thank you very much for joining me in that photo and joining me in the spirit of this wonderful award, which I'm profoundly honored to receive. This is a wonderful, wonderful world-leading university, and to be associated with it in this remarkable way for me is really a very wonderful life moment, and I'm profoundly grateful. And Professor Walsh knows my career better than I do, and puts it in a wonderful light also, and I'm really grateful to Paul Walsh for all his collegiality and his partnership, because we work together on sustainable development and on fighting poverty and on spreading the word of the Masters of Development practice all over the world. And it's an absolutely wonderful, wonderful adventure to do it together with you, and also to have the chance, because of this great day for me, to be together with the MDP students and all of the fantastic initiatives that I just caught a glimpse of. More than rating universities by how many articles are read by whomever, rating universities by their spirit of getting out to solve world problems puts you right on the top of the list. And congratulations to you, because UHC's contributions to the world are enormous. I also have to say, I feel just a little bit like Leopold Bloom today. I'm making my peregrinations around Dublin, so I have a 24-hour stay, so it's fitting to get the Ulysses Prize for managing a one-day tour of Dublin. And I met with the business leaders this morning, and now together with you on this marvelous occasion, and I'll meet President Higgins in the afternoon, which is a fantastic opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to that. And then dinner with MDP students and others, so it's a really great, great day for me. Let me start with actually a quotation of a poet, John Masefield, that President John F. Kennedy began with when he gave what is my favorite speech of any American president. So I heartily recommend it to you. It's a speech that he gave about problem solving on June 10, 1963. And the problem that he was after to solve was the problem of peace. Pretty big problem. And he was our greatest statesman of peace that we had. And he gave this magnificent address that I've learned a lot from and commend to you about problem solving at commencement ceremony at American University in Washington, D.C. And he quoted John Masefield, who said that there are few earthly things more beautiful than a university. For a university is a place for those who hate ignorance may come to know, and those who perceive truth may help others to see it too. And I think that that idea that universities are among the most beautiful earthly things that we have is absolutely true. And President Kennedy went to American University because he said he wanted to talk about a topic piece that didn't necessarily command the public attention, but it demanded the vision of truth. And I would say today that our challenge of sustainable development that you've held up in your placards with the Sustainable Development Goals requires the universities to lead uniquely and to lead as well. And in the case of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's a matter of perhaps three things that are crucial that give the university this role. One is truth, to perceive what we need to do. on the planet and that we can actually do it. The second is expertise, because our challenges, while achievable and our goals within reach, are definitely complex. There's nothing simple about any of those placards that you're holding. Take a look at whatever number you have, number SDG 13 on climate change, or any of the goals that you have. Look at what it calls upon all of us to do, and think about doing that in 14 years remaining. This is a 15-year process, and we've already spent one of those years, because these goals were adopted on September 25th, 2015. And the third thing that these goals need is truth and expertise, but they also need ethical commitment. That's where Cardinal Newman comes in. That's where the Catholic social teachings are absolutely essential. The idea that we're not spectators in a unfolding drama. We are the participants and the protagonists who are needed to help shape the kind of future that we want. There's nothing automatic about the success of these goals or automatic about their failure. And I'm often asked, am I optimistic about them? And I often answer that I find the question almost irrelevant, because what I am is a firm believer that these goals are realistic, that they're achievable, and that they're important, and that our job is to do whatever we can to make them be achieved. Whereas if you're asked the question, are you an optimist or a pessimist, that's a good question if you're a gambler, if you're at a racetrack, if you're a handicapper trying to place a bet, if you're an economic forecaster. Those are all valid questions, but they're not the question that interests me, and I don't think that they're the main question that should interest us. The main question that should interest us is, how can we achieve these goals? And how can we achieve them in a technical sense? What would it take to stop human-induced climate change? What would it take to end extreme poverty? What would it take to ensure that every child has access to quality education from pre-kindergarten at least through secondary completion, SDG 4? Or what would it take to ensure that everybody on this planet is able to realize their human right to health? And then how can we help society to see that this can be done and that it should be done in the moral sense, that this is something for human well-being, and because it's within reach, it is our moral obligation to help it to be reached. So this is the mindset that I've been stuck with as an economist for a while, because you learn two different kinds of things in economics. One is, and for me, the glory of the profession and its idea, you learn that society has know-how, and it has technologies, it has resources, and therefore it has the potential to do certain things. And even in introductory economics, we draw a curve which we call a production possibility frontier, which is a diagram which is a figurative way to display what are the choices facing society. That's one kind of idea. Another kind of idea that we learn is that we live in a market economy, and markets are driven by consumers and producers, and that there is a balance of supply and demand that's somehow realized, and that leads to what we call an equilibrium. And that's the outcome of the economy. I believe one of these visions is right and the other is only a half-truth. The first one I find compelling because it enables us to ask the question, what are our possibilities? Literally, what could we produce? Could we produce the end of poverty? Could we produce the end of an AIDS epidemic? Could we produce a low-carbon energy system? Those are all fancy questions that basically ask us to understand what is the shape of a production possibility frontier. The other question is more the spectator question, which is what's going to happen? And economists sometimes simplify by saying what's going to happen is what consumers and producers want to happen. And that leads to by the invisible hand of Adam Smith, to an equilibrium. And that tells us how resources should be allocated. And the problem with that view is that what can happen through processes like that, because of the way markets work or fail to work, or because of greed or other considerations that twist resources one way or another, can be simply horrific in their outcome. And if we don't keep in mind what's possible, but only take as given what is, we miss the greatest question of all, which is what should we be doing individually and collectively to make life better for people on the planet. And the inventor of politics and economics in the Western world, Aristotle, said these should be ways of thinking for human well-being. But sometimes we get stuck as spectators or predictors, and we forget that the moral agency is perhaps the most important issue that we face. In Catholic social teachings, there's a doctrine that I really adore called the universal destination of goods. And the idea of the universal destination of goods in Catholic social teaching, which began in a famous encyclical called Rerum Novarum, the new things of the world in the industrial age in 1891, was that a market economy has lots of merit, and it can be efficient, it can give freedom, it can give good outcomes, but it should never be confused with the true equilibrium, with the true end goal. Private property rights can be important, but they are not inviolable. That's a basic idea of the church, and it's a correct idea, because what counts in the end is not private property rights, but human well-being. And I'll give the way that I came to see this, and in a way could never stop seeing it that way again. I worked on many problems, as Professor Walsh described, where it just seemed to me, thinking of what's possible, that the outcomes we were seeing were simply horrible compared to what any decent vision of what should happen would tell us. So when I advised a very impoverished and bankrupt, insolvent government in Bolivia in 1985, this was a government through the result of years and years of serious mismanagement, corruption, narco-trafficking of multiple unstable governments over a period of, well, over a long period, but over a very intense period of bad governance of a decade, ended up bankrupt. And you know, when governments end up bankrupt, they print money, and the Bolivian government printed a lot of money to such an extent that it caused not just an inflation, but a hyperinflation, which means that the prices are rising by thousands of percent. And by the time I was asked to look at this situation, the annualized inflation rate had reached 60,000% per year. That's a pretty nasty inflation. And you try to solve a problem like that because that's a horrible way to live, and a lot of people were suffering badly. So in the end, you have to find a way so that government doesn't have to print the money to undertake its basic functions. And to do that, you have to find the revenues for the government or aid. And one of the things I said was, well, this government is bankrupt, and it owes a lot of debt to, actually it was Citibank and some other US banks at the time. And so I said, to get out of this crisis, let's just cancel the debt. And that was back in 1985. It was a little bit of a heretical proposition. Citibank didn't like it too much. But I knew also from history that this is how these crises had been resolved. Many of my colleagues said, well, that's cheating. You have to use the budget constraints. You know, they have to pay back the debt. I said, well, they're very, very poor, and it's not that the public took these debts. This is horrendous governance, and if we don't find a way forward, this horrendous instability is going to continue. And the long and the short of it was that after a very odd and interesting year of bickering and negotiating, actually Bolivia finally got its debts canceled, and they were able to consolidate the end of the hyperinflation and make a recovery. And I thought that's what this possibility vision makes possible. We have to find how to devote our resources in a way that can improve well-being, and sometimes it's a little bit unusual, and sometimes if banks have made loans to impoverished places that should never have been made and can't really be paid back in a humane way, maybe those debts need to be canceled. And I applied that 3 years later in a little bit more jocular way. When you have one debt cancellation under your belt, you go for it. So when the Polish government asked me to advise them, and they were very worried that they were completely bankrupt the same way under the Soviet era, I became their advisor, and when the first post-communist government came to power, they asked me to speak to the parliament or the solidarity members of the parliament that same evening in this historic moment in 1989. And I accompanied the majority leader of the United States Senate at the time, Robert Dole, who was representing President Bush. So it was the two of us speaking. So Senator Dole stood up and said that, of course, the United States is so excited about the freedom that Poland has won, and Poland should count on the United States for anything to secure the new freedom of Poland. So he sat down, and I stood up, and I said, you heard what Senator Dole said. So I suggest to you just sending a postcard to the White House that our debt is canceled. I actually said you need to send 7 postcards because they had 7 creditor governments. And I became known as the postcard theory of Poland's recovery. And it worked, by the way, because the Western nations deemed it to be in the interests of the new post-communist realities to help Poland to have a fresh start, and $16 billion of debt were canceled in that way, and Poland indeed was able to get a fresh start. Well, when you take that kind of perspective, let me emphasize to all of you, our problems in this world are not even that hard. They're a little bit complicated. They require the full measure of your expertise and our expertise. They require the universities. They require the schools of public health, your virology laboratory. They require engineering schools. They require finance and economic expertise. But the extent of the effort that we need to solve our goals, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, is shockingly small compared to the scale of benefit that we could achieve. Here's the deal. Ask the question, what would it take to ensure that every child can get at least a secondary education on the planet? Understanding that today, for example, in many poor countries, only 20% of the kids are able to complete high school, a high school education, because there's no financing, and they can't afford the tuition, and the government can't afford even to provide universal basic secondary schooling. What would it take if we were to give some help? If the richer countries were to say, we'll pick up the tab that the poorest countries can't manage on their own? The answer is almost unbelievable. It is that every estimate, I've made some, UNESCO has made some, a recent commission by former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown just made similar calculations. The answer is we have a financing gap, a resource need for the poorest countries of about $40 billion a year. Now, here's where the economics comes in, basically long division. Because if you add up Ireland's national income and America's national income and Japan's national income and the income of the high income democratic nations, the ones in the OECD, the sum total of our incomes now is on the order of $50 trillion per year. So what is 40 billion of 50 trillion? It is 0.08 of 1% of our income. In other words, not even 1/10 of 1% of the income of the rich world is the financial gap to enable the poorest countries to deploy the teachers, the school buildings, the electricity, the connectivity to be able to manage a universal access, at least through secondary education. That's not an economic problem, 0.08%. That is a moral problem, perhaps. Maybe it is a psychological problem. Maybe for some of our leaders, it's a psychiatric problem, or ones that we might have if we have bad luck in the United States. But it's not a fundamental economic problem. What our production possibility frontier tells us is this is readily achievable. And I've spent 15 years knowing rather little in depth about lots of things, but having a good trick, which I advise to all of you. When in doubt, ask somebody who knows. What a trick. Almost nobody does it. But when you really want to find out something, go knock on the door of a colleague, or go knock on the door of a professor, or go find out what you can. Generally, don't just do a Google search. That won't be good enough. But I asked AIDS specialists, what would it take to control the AIDS epidemic? And they all told me basically the same thing about how treatment could be effective at very low cost. I asked malariologists, what could it take to control the malaria epidemic? They gave me quite similar answers because there's a lot of expertise and a lot of knowledge. And the amounts at stake were so tiny, it's unbelievable. The nothing costs that we are not bearing and thereby having millions of people die every year because we don't have the wit to do the most basic arithmetic and to say this is absurd. Now again, if you're a market economist where markets are everything, I'm cheating everything I'm saying, because one of the things you learn in economics is a budget constraint. And I just don't believe that very poor countries have budget constraints, because they have us as partners to help. And we don't have budget constraints in one sense because we waste so much money on frivolous things that we don't even know what we're doing. And because we have 1,800 billionaires in the world who together have more than $7 trillion of wealth, so they wouldn't even notice if they were the ones that were called upon to end AIDS, malaria, TB, get every child in school. Fewer than 2,000 people could do this if we tried. So that's the limit of economics, in my view, which is to realize all the wonderful things we can do when we put our mind to it and when we put our expertise to it. If you take the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and add up the costs, nobody's done it fully. My colleagues and I in the Sustainable Development Solutions Network have tried at least to get some rough ideas. I published a book a few years ago called Commonwealth, where I tried to make estimates. I made estimates again in a book last year called The Age of Sustainable Development. For the life of me, I can't find it to cost more than 3% of our annual output to end poverty, ensure universal access to goods, convert the energy system to a low-carbon energy system, and protect the biosphere. Are you kidding? I said 3%. Maybe you'd say, you're stretching it, Professor Sachs, it's all the way up to 5%. And that could be true, it may turn out. But remember that we are a $100 trillion world economy. 50 trillion in the rich world now, 50 trillion in the developing countries. 100 trillion is a mighty big denominator for any sum you throw our way. And so even if it's a few $1 trillion a year, even if someone says to you, these goals are ridiculous, it's trillions of dollars, do not blink. Say, that's correct, but that's only 3% of our annual output. And we would be reckless to lose the chance to save millions of species, or to save millions of lives of children every year, or to convert our world energy system to low-carbon energy so that we escape the extreme dangers that we face of human-induced climate change. Well, we have our work cut out for us. We have a short period of time. That's not an arbitrary truth, unfortunately. It's a time horizon that's given to us by nature. It's a time horizon that's given to us by very unpleasant carbon arithmetic, which tells us that we've put so much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that we're on the verge of trespassing the most dangerous planetary boundaries right now. It's a time horizon that is put on us by virtue of the fact that millions of species are at risk of extinction at human hands through habitat destruction, climate change, ocean acidification, poisoning of the air and the water, and over-harvesting. So the time has been assigned to us, not dictated by us anymore, because we've lost so much time when we could have done this in a more leisurely way. So I'm a professor, and most of you are students, so I get to give you a homework assignment. And the homework assignment, you know what's coming. The homework assignment is to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And if it seems a little daunting, there are two parts of the assignment that I want to stress to you. One is that it is utterly open book. You can use any resource you can find. And second, you must work in groups. And I count on us not only for you to work in groups, for us to work together for this glorious cause, because the universities need to take the lead. And University College Dublin is one of the world's great universities in spirit, in science, in action, and I count on you to take that lead. Thank you very much. Thanks.